disproportionate share of papers in these broadly disseminated journals demonstrates the breadth of interest beyond the traditional scientific disciplines. And here are 3 covers of Nature and Science that feature some of our research. I'll come back to a couple of these a little bit later. The Deep Carbon Observatory, I'm going to say just a little bit about our organization and structure. We have 4 science communities. One that might interest you most is really condensed matter physics. It's our extreme physics and chemistry group. They do a lot of both ab initio calculations as well as high-pressure experiments, high-temperature experiments on phases of carbon-bearing phases at extreme conditions. We have a reservoirs and fluxes group that looks at the quantities and the chemical mass transfer of carbon among different reservoirs within planet Earth. We talked a bunch about deep energy, and if we look at Titan and other moons and satellites of Saturn or Jupiter, we'll see methane clouds, methane lakes, methane precipitation, a methane hydrologic cycle. All of that methane we believe to be abiotic. So Earth is 4.5 billion years old. In the last 4.5 billion years, how much of Earth's methane is abiotic? Clearly, most fossil fuels are exactly that. They're derived from life. But we have lots of ways to produce methane independent of life. And how can you tell? Methane is a molecule with only 5 atoms. There are no biomarkers on it. So we've determined some new ways of sort of making some new measurements of methane in order to say a lot about its origins and properties. And I talk a bunch about deep life, and deep in this context is shallow by the context of the rest of the Deep Carbon Observatory. But it turns out a very large fraction of all life on Earth is substantially below our feet. Below the critical zone, below the soil horizons, and we know remarkably little about that, and we're doing a lot of genomic studies. We're studying the diversity and abundance of life in subsurface environments, and sometimes, it's almost science fiction life. We have organisms that seem to reproduce at, say, 1,000-year time scales. The definition of life says nothing about the rate of reproduction of life. In addition to these science communities, we have a series of cross-cutting activities that include our field studies, which generally work across our science communities. Instrumentation, we invested very heavily early in our decadal program in instrumentation to make measurements that have never been possible to make before, but every one of these is a hypothesis-driven instrumentation development project. We wanted to test a hypothesis, like what's the origin of this methane, and we needed to make a measurement that had never been made before. We designed and built instruments to do those types of things. And a lot of our work is underwritten by data science and modeling and visualization. So the DCO is organized around an executive committee and a secretariat. The secretariat is the global headquarters, and that's based at the Geophysical Lab here in Washington, D.C. And our 4 science communities are highly distributed around the world. We're not a Carnegie project. We're not a U.S. project. We're very much an international, interdisciplinary project. I just want to say that community building is something we take very seriously. I would say that even the management of the observatory is an extremely challenging problem, as challenging as many of the scientific problems. And community building is something that is very much an explicit goal. In order for us to achieve our scientific objectives, we need to engage people from around the world and across different disciplines, many of whom hardly speak the same language scientifically, never mind different actual languages. So we've invested very heavily in workshops and meetings. We use social media and mass media to reach these large and diverse audiences. We had a press release in December that reached 1.4 billion people, according to the standard metrics for these things. And again, I'm just going to run through some recent meetings we've had in China to engage a growing number of Chinese colleagues in all the areas of work that we do, including field sites. But this particular meeting was held at the Shanghai Synchrotron. So we're doing a lot of high-pressure experiments. We use synchrotron radiation to analyze the materials that are obviously very small size. And we are expanding our footprint in China and to use some of this instrumentation and some of their field sites. We held a meeting in India to engage the Indian geological community and physics and chemistry communities in greater detail. We held our own meeting in the UK last year. We've held the previous one in Germany, and before that the National Academy here in Washington, D.C. We have a very large and active group in Japan. This is a photograph of the Chikyu, which is by far and away the world's largest scientific research vessel. And our research has actually broken technology records that don't concern us very much in terms of the deepest coring below sea floor. and some of these are at the depths of the deep water horizon. And then we have a huge collaboration with colleagues in Italy, where they have some of the best techniques, field-based techniques for monitoring volcanoes. But you'd be surprised that the vast majority of Earth's most dangerous volcanoes have no real-time streaming data. It's very much unlike our global seismic network. And so in a sense, one of our visions is to develop a global volcano monitoring network that's actually much more difficult in terms of the diversity of measurements you need to make, that resembles our global seismic network. But I'll point out that global seismic networks are great for things like three-dimensional seismic tomographic images of our planet. But initially, the big investment in global seismic networks was developed by the Department of Defense for comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty monitoring. And this is what Frank Press was most famous for. Arguably, Frank Press saved more human lives than any human in human history by preventing the proliferation and use of nuclear weapons through this global monitoring system. And as most of you know, he served for 12 years as president of the National Academies. During that time, he tried to improve volcano monitoring networks, and we made remarkably little improvement during that time period, but we're moving very rapidly now. We're doing a lot of drilling in the continents as well as on the oceans to get deep samples, and there's a project in Oman I'll be talking about in greater detail a little bit later. But our greatest asset, arguably, is our early career scientists. We've held workshops for them around the world. They're engaged in everything we do, and they are now the principal investigators of many of our projects. They are our future. In order to perpetuate deep carbon science beyond the end of our decadal program, we organized a brand new Gordon Research Conference on deep carbon science that met first last year. It'll meet next year after our decadal program ends, and then hopefully every 2 years after that for quite some time. So we're trying to institutionalize sustainable successors to some of our institutional structures. I just want to mention some of our cross-cutting activities in a little bit greater detail. And I'm going to talk first for a moment about instrumentation. Let's try this again. We're going to say... Okay, we'll get right back there, no worries.
That was Yosemite.
I just want to say a few words about instrumentation. As I said, that new instrumentation is needed to achieve each set of our decadal goals. So we have these 4 science communities. Each has a set of guiding questions, a set of decadal goals, and each of these instrumentation development projects is hypothesis-driven. Many of these are very much high risk, high reward. We don't expect success in every front. And we did front-load the decade in large investments knowing the long lead times. We've had a series of partnerships between academic institutions and private sector companies, and we're actually commercializing a lot of this instrumentation by existing companies as well as by some startups. And the spectrum of instruments that we've developed, range from large volume diamond anvil cells for use in the is a very special place as a geologist. There's something called an ophiolite, which is a section of the oceanic crust. So the Earth is 70% covered by ocean basins. The oceanic crust is fundamentally different than the continental crust. And we don't have complete sections of the oceanic crust anywhere because they're under several kilometers of ocean. In Oman, the oceanic crust has been pushed up onto the continent, and we're drilling basically a complete section through the oceanic crust into the underlying mantle. And we're actually taking the samples from Oman to Japan, and we're analyzing them aboard the Chikyu while it's at dock and being unused. They can't afford to operate the ship year-round. We said, well, gee, it's the world's most advanced core processing laboratory. Can we use it for that? And they said, absolutely. So it's been a great partnership between Japan and Oman for that project. Our early career scientists have spent months and months traveling up and down the backbone of the Andes with the world's first mobile volcano observatory. So they're bringing instruments to make measurements in the field. We're using drones there. We're taking instruments to the volcanoes. We're taking samples to the laboratories.
and we're making the very first measurements in many cases of certain gas emissions from these particular volcanoes. And as you can see, these are very harsh environments, and they're really tough on your field and laboratory equipment. Trying to make isotopic measurements in the field where pH might be 2 or something, and there's low temperatures, high winds. These are very, very challenging problems. Right now, we have a group that's deploying drones well beyond the line of sight to make the very first measurements of some of the world's largest sulfur dioxide emitting volcanoes, for which there are 0 CO2 emissions data. And so these drones are equipped with instruments to make these measurements or to collect samples beyond the line of sight. We've been there once. We're going to go back in just a couple months now. And our field expedition to Costa Rica is integrating our biologists with our geologists in the first real systematic study of the intersection between biology and plate tectonics and the effect of the subduction process on the life in the subduction zone. And the first paper that they've written, that's all early career scientists from around the world, is in review in Nature. I believe it's been provisionally accepted to Nature. So I'm going to focus most of my time, though, on the work of the 4 science communities, starting with our extreme physics, actually starting with some of our research on diamonds. And diamonds, in this sense, are the simplest carbon-bearing compound at one level. They have one element, largely just pure carbon. And this is a 2016 cover from Science. I love the large gem diamonds from metallic liquid in Earth's deep mantle. So this is a 404.5 carat diamond. It was discovered in 2016. It's probably worth many tens of millions of dollars. It's crown jewel size. They will not let us touch it. But we have a partnership with the Gemological Institute of America. It's conceivable this diamond could be worth on the order of $100 million, but it's certainly worth tens of millions of dollars. But they don't want the inclusions within the diamonds, and the inclusions within the diamonds are a window into Earth's deep interior. And this particular diamond is one of the deepest diamonds ever recovered. And so the samples that we have of Earth's deep interior that are trapped inside this diamond are among the deepest samples that we've ever had. How do we know that? Well, the mineral structures that are present are retained at the pressure in which the diamond forms. These diamonds were formed in some cases at depths of 400, 600 kilometers, and the pressure is internal to the diamond today. You can pick it up, it's on the order of 20 gigapascals. And so if you were to decompress the inclusions, in many cases they'll explode and invert very quickly to some other more stable form at 1 bar. So this particular diamond is just shocking in that the inclusions include native metal alloys of iron and nickel. And it's believed that this diamond, and one of the reasons why it's such a rare, large type 2 diamond, is that we believe it grew from a metallic liquid, not in Earth's core, but in Earth's deep mantle. And this is, in a sense, a new class of diamond formations. Diamonds form in many different ways, but the suite of inclusions in this diamond tells us a lot about its origin. And I'll talk more about diamonds as tracers of the deep carbon cycle, but in some cases we're confident that the carbon began its cycle at the surface, went to some depth of 300, 600 kilometers in these cases below the transition zone or at the bottom of the transition zone, and now it's down at the surface. And time scales for that deep carbon cycle can be on the order of 1 billion years. In some cases, not in this diamond, we've been able to date the mineral inclusions. There's actually a group at the University of Maryland that's very active in this, as well as Carnegie, using rhenium-osmium isotopic systematics and neodymium samarium isotopic systematics to date the minerals that are inclusions in the diamond. This much more recent paper is on the cover of Science in August of last year, and it's a blue boron-bearing diamond from Earth's lower mantle. And I want to focus a little bit not on the fact that it's blue, the color is not of great scientific interest, but boron makes it blue, and there's shockingly little boron in Earth's deep interior. So how did this diamond come to have a much higher concentration of boron than you'll find in the mantle? And so the main purpose of this paper is to demonstrate that this diamond is a tracer of this deep carbon cycle, that the carbon it might very well have come from the crust, and that the boron that is trapped in the diamond today almost certainly is from hydrous minerals that were, as a result of plate tectonics, subducted deep into the Earth's interior, past the 410 kilometer discontinuity, past the 660 kilometer discontinuities. These discontinuities are measured seismically, and they're generally related to changes in mineral structure as the coordination number, for example, increases as a function of pressure. And so it's believed that this ultra deep diamond has materials from Earth's surface. And again, it's very hard to make that case strongly, and this is one of the strongest cases we've been able to make. So diamonds form as a result of crystallization from metallic liquid, as shown in the last slide. They're formed in a completely different manner in this case. And I also want to show a third way in which diamonds can form, and here's a case in which highly saline fluids from a subducting tectonic plate is the source of the fluid-rich diamonds. This is a particular type of diamond that has these cloudy rims at the edges that are filled with fluid inclusions. And later on, I'll show you a modeling paper and some experimental data in which we measured the chemical composition of the fluid inclusions here. And we can model that you can form a diamond as a result of minor perturbations in pH. And so if you look at many natural diamonds, but not all, they'll have multiple growth zones. They'll have multiple episodes of growth, resorption, growth, resorption, growth, resorption, on and on and on. Well, how do you do that? Most people would say, well, these diamonds grew in COH, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen fluids. I'll point out there are no ions. They've modeled for decades these fluids as molecular fluids. And in part they did that because they didn't have any way to model the ions. But you can demonstrate that, so did pressure go up and down to form the growth and resorption? I don't think so. Did temperature cycle? Possibly. Perhaps oxygen fugacity. But it's almost certain that the pH would change systematically as a function of time. And you can demonstrate that even at constant temperature and pressure, you can have multiple episodes of growth and resorption of diamonds as a result of minor perturbations in pH. So there are lots of different ways to form
Around
diamonds.
which pH do these fluctuations occur?
So that's a great question. So remember, neutral pH is defined not as 7, but as equal concentrations of H plus and OH minus. And under these temperature pressure conditions, I'm going to have to look up what neutral pH would be. But we'll come back to that in a study that's specifically addressing this in a moment. One of our most highly cited papers is this next one, which is a hydrous mantle transition zone indicated by ringwoodite included within a diamond. So ringwoodite is a mineral that has been found in nature to be a named mineral, has to be found in nature. It was found, I believe, initially in a meteorite impact. And so it's something that was formed at very, very high pressures, but there's never been a natural sample from Earth's deep interior until one was found in this particular diamond. So based on one inclusion in one diamond, they measured the water content of that one ringwoodite inclusion. Again, it's a high pressure polymorph of silicate. And they determined it had 1.4 weight% water. And on the basis of that, if all the ringwoodite in Earth's transition zone, and we have a very good estimate of that based on seismic data, had 1.4 weight% water, there'd be an ocean of water. And the press release on this, we did not write it, even had waves of water. Of course, this is all structurally bound water. But the idea that there's at least an ocean of water in the transition zone of Earth's interior, which is only one small part of Earth's deep interior, is just remarkable. And this is the very first natural sample we have that allows us to measure directly the water content of this mineral. Now remember, it was almost certainly trapped when the diamond grew, and it's remained unchanged in the diamond capsule since that time. Now, a colleague of mine has a nanosims, so he can, it's a secondary ionization mass spectrometer, and he wanted to measure the hydrogen deuterium ratio of the water. And I said, don't you dare do that, it's a destructive test. You're gonna have to ablate the diamond and expose the ringwoodite. And I said, why do you think there were exactly 0 samples of ringwoodite from Earth's deep interior except for this one? That's because it almost certainly inverts really fast to a much more stable phase at 1 bar. Well, somebody didn't get my memo, and somebody in Canada ablated the sample. It exploded. We have not a trace of it left. And we went back to Brazil to buy, in this case, many more samples of raw diamonds from these ultra-deep diamond sources to see if we can find more ringwoodite. But I told a colleague of mine who's the curator of rocks and minerals at the rocks and ores at the Smithsonian, and I thought she was going to faint. I mean, you should treat this with greater respect than you would your typical lunar sample or type specimen or something. This is one of the top 10 most abundant minerals in Earth's mantle, and this is the only sample we've ever had from Earth's deep interior. We will find more. But this is one of our most highly cited papers. It's extremely important for decades. Geophysicists have calculated with ab initio calculations that ringwoodite should be one of the most abundant phases. We've done experiments to synthesize ringwoodite hundreds and hundreds of times, but there's never been a single sample found until this one, and we've lost it.
Could you explain a little bit more about what ringwoodite is?
Okay, well, let me do that a little bit on this next sample. Here we have calcium silicate perovskite. And this is, again, probably the fourth most abundant mineral in Earth's deep interior. But there are 0 samples of this in nature because it doesn't even have a name. To be a named sample, you have to measure its crystal structure and report it in a certain way. It's been, again, hypothesized for decades that this mineral would exist in Earth's deep interior. And for the very first time, and it was reported in Nature, so it must be true. We actually have great doubts about this paper, which is one of ours. There's many indirect lines of evidence that the diamond inclusions include several different high pressure phases, including this calcium silicate perovskite. But this high pressure structure had never been found in nature before, even though it's believed to be one of the most abundant minerals in the Earth's deep interior. We now have a suite of samples in the blue diamond that we're reasonably confident are much better samples of calcium silicate perovskite. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but essentially as you go to higher and higher pressure, it's going to increase the coordination number and density of these materials. So at close to 1 bar, the magnesium iron silicate is called olivine that's stable, and you find it in common basaltic rocks. It's in the Earth's upper mantle. But at higher and higher pressures, the structure changes dramatically, and you increase the coordination number of the key elements, and you form different mineral structures. And we can measure those those structures from synthetic samples in diamond anvil cells, but we've never observed them before. And we synthesize the materials at high pressures. We measure the crystal structure measurements at high pressures. But many of these are unquenchable. But I'll talk about a couple structures in more detail that are a little bit simpler actually next. So if you just take simple CO2, I like to start with simple compounds. CO2, gas in the atmosphere, it's a linear molecule, double bonds, carbon, oxygen, double bonds, linear molecule. What happens if you compress CO2 to really high pressures? Well, again, we'd calculated for years, but we had no experiments to demonstrate you would form, instead of these linear molecules, you would form CO4 tetrahedra. Now, I'm going to back up and give you a quick mineralogy 101. So to a first order a 0th order approximation that's not very useful, Earth's crust is, the vast majority of Earth's crust is simply oxygen with all the oxygen anions, with all the cations stuffed in between them. That's not a useful approximation. To a very useful first order approximation, much of Earth's crust and mantle, silicate Earth, is formed of silica tetrahedra, SiO4, so silicon in the middle, 4 oxygens in a tetrahedral arrangement around them. So here's all of mineralogy in a nutshell, all of silicate mineralogy, which is almost all of mineralogy. You can have isolated silica tetrahedra with cations between them, and those are called olivines, and they're really abundant in sort of salt that you can collect in Earth's oceans. You can collect them on the moons and the Maria. You can see them with your naked eye. Those are basaltic rocks with lots of olivine. Those are isolated silica tetrahedra. You can line up the tetrahedra to form single chains, so you join the corners. These are tetrahedra joined at the corners. So those are tetrahedra not of silica. You can form, those are called pyroxenes. There's a huge literature on pyroxenes. Those are single chain silicates. You can have double chain silicates. So you have a row of silica tetrahedra all lined up, where the silica tetrahedra are joined at corners, and then you can have 2 of those together. Those are double chains. Those are called amphiboles, and there's a huge literature on amphiboles. There's one other mineral group that most of you are familiar with. That's micas. So you go from 1 chain to 2 chains to an infinite sheet, and the macroscopic structure of the micas resembles the microscopic structure, that you have silica tetrahedra in these sheet structures with the cations in between them, and other anions in this case. And then you can have 3-dimensional networks of tetrahedra with the corners touching. Now, and then at higher and higher pressures, you might imagine edge sharing or face sharing, okay? But at low pressures, and that's how you get these denser and denser structures, for example. So you increase the coordination number, and then once you have a coordination number, you might edge share or face share rather than corner share. So we had hypothesized that CO4 tetrahedra would exist. But nobody had ever measured this, and so we invested very heavily. This measurement turned out to be much harder to do than you to get. Guess there were attempts in the literature, and I don't know what they were measuring. So diamond anvil cells, remember, pressure is force divided by area, so we don't need much force because the area is really, really small, but our samples are really small, so we use synchrotrons to interrogate the samples and measure the crystal structures. I don't know what these people were measuring before, but measuring CO2 in a diamond anvil is hard. You're measuring carbon and carbon. But two groups simultaneously, ours is Centauro, in 2012 demonstrated that you have these network structures of CO4 tetrahedra in nature. So then we asked, can there be single chains of double chains, sheets? And energetically, the network structure is completely favored over all the others. But we demonstrated this, and then one question is, does this exist in nature? Believe me, it's not been found. This is CO2, polymeric CO2 phase 5. But the next question, this is what I lose sleep over at night, these kind of questions, is, well, what if you could substitute CO4 tetrahedra for SiO4 tetrahedra? Because since most of the silicate Earth is made up of SiO4 tetrahedra, well, if you could have 100 parts per million of CO2 throughout the mantle in solid solution with SiO4 tetrahedra, that would be by far and away the vast majority of Earth's carbon. And we proved right away that you can have extensive solid solution between CO4 tetrahedra and SiO4 tetrahedra. This had never been done before. So essentially you're replacing carbon for silicon in a silicon tetrahedra. And then Alexandra Navratsky at Davis said, well, what about replacing carbon for oxygen in silicon tetrahedra? And she did that right away as well, but not under Earth-like conditions, but maybe under sort of some exoplanet conditions. So then the question is, under what conditions can this polymeric CO2 exist? And to our great surprise, we demonstrated that you can have this polymeric CO2 as a solid phase almost all the way down to the core mantle boundary. And this is a huge surprise, and many people expected this to dissociate into diamond and O2, for example, or other species, but these experiments seem to indicate that polymeric CO2 is stable right down to almost the core mantle boundary. So we've looked at diamond, we've looked at CO2. I just want to spend a little bit of time on carbonates. So much of the carbon in Earth's crust is in carbonate minerals, and as a result of plate tectonic subduction, a lot of that carbonate gets subducted into Earth's deep interior. At low pressures, the carbon is in trigonal CO3 planar structure here. But again, we had calculated, based on ab initio calculations and experiments, that we should be able to produce CO4 tetrahedra under high pressures. But again, this had not been experimentally verified, and so with and then we would have sp3 hybrid bonds that would produce this structure rather than this structure. And we have several different groups around the world looking at these tetrahedrally coordinated carbonates and trying to map out their pressure and temperature stability limits as a function of chemical composition. So there's this group that's based in part of the geophysical lab. There's a group at Stanford, Wendy Mao's group, looking at tetrahedrally coordinated carbonates in Earth's lower mantle, so even higher pressure. And it turns out the group in Germany is demonstrating that if you have a significant mole fraction of iron, perhaps 7 mole%, which is very common in Precambrian carbonates, you can really increase the stability limits of these carbonates right down to the Earth's very deep mantle, close to the core mantle boundary. And again, we're doing a lot more experiments showing that you can have carbonates in equilibrium, we believe, are coexisting with these iron carbide compounds and other reduced phases, so simultaneously having the oxidized and reduced carbon in these very high pressures. So I want to leave the sort of materials for a second and then move on to fluids. And it turns out there have been thousands of papers written by geologists about the chemical speciation and the chemical mass transfer of material in aqueous fluids. But the vast majority of those studies were limited to very, very low pressures. And if you ask most of the people who work in this field why that's the case, why they can't extrapolate their calculations to much higher pressures, they'll almost all give you the same answer, is that the calculations are very sensitive to the dielectric constant of water, and that the dielectric constant of water is virtually unconstrained above some very low pressure. So we decided to engage in some very expensive calculations to estimate the dielectric constant of water as a function of pressure to orders of magnitude higher pressures. And our sponsors, who are very generous, said, well, wait a second, we're funding the Deep Carbon Observatory, and now you're making measurements of the fundamental properties of water. So we were very fortunate the people that did this agreed with our advice to have a little bit of work on the effects of by understanding the transport of water, the properties of water, we can talk about the transport of carbonates in deep earth. And this paper in PNAS, again, is very highly cited, and it's been the basis for what we call our deep earth water model. So once we were able to know the dielectric constant of water, we're able to do some fairly simple calculations and demonstrating that carbon dioxide in water-rich fluids is actually very rarely as a molecular species. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers that model, in my view, incorrectly, CO2 H2O mixtures as molecular fluids, whereas almost none of the CO2 under these deep earth conditions would be present as molecular CO2. There are a whole series of other ions that will be present that are much, much more abundant than the CO2, which affects the mixing properties quite strongly. So to the extent that chemical mass transfer is very, very sensitive to our understanding of the speciation of the fluid, this is a very big development. In fact, there's this paper in Nature that says there's implications for volatile and global metal cycles based on this deep earth water model, and demonstrating that the pH of the subduction zone fluids is a very important factor in determining the chemical mass transfer once we can have a better speciation based on our deep earth water model. So I want to tell you some interesting results based on the deep earth water model. And I mentioned earlier that diamonds can form as a result of a drop in pH. So I showed you a picture of diamond with those cloudy rims around the edge. And that cloudiness is resulting from huge numbers of fluid inclusions. And if you look at those fluid inclusions and measure their chemical compositions, which is not so easy, you can determine that those fluids are in chemical equilibrium with a very common mantle mineral assemblage. But if you move that fluid to contact a different mantle mineral assemblage, it will react with the fluid. And you can demonstrate that in isobaric and isothermal conditions, as a result of minor perturbations in pH, you'll first produce diamond, resorb diamond, and then grow diamond as a simple function of reaction progress at constant temperature and pressure under our presumed mantle conditions. So this is, in a sense, a revolutionary way to form diamond as a result of minor perturbations in pH. But one of the things that motivated our deep earth water model to begin with was to look at the possibility of abiotic formation of organic molecules in subduction zone fluids. And we had some really interesting results as in the basis of these calculations. And I love this accompanying perspective piece, Subduction Goes Organic. And the press release, I didn't write this stuff, it's a very exciting possibility that these deep fluids might transport building blocks for life into the shallow earth. This may be a key to the origin of life. Darwin thought that life might have begun in some warm, pool or hot spring somewhere. We're now asking about the possibility that life began in Earth's deep interior, and it had nothing to do with photosynthesis and relationship to the sun, for example. And we're demonstrating now experimentally that some of the compounds that were predicted in these calculations, including isobutane, are now found as immiscible hydrocarbon fluids in experiments in diamond anvil cells. And so we're iterating between model experiment, and trying to place better and better constraints on the chemical mass transfer of material in these subduction zone fluids. I've mentioned already that methane can be produced abiotically in actually many different ways. I want to make it clear that most of the hydrocarbons that we use for our fuel are indeed fossil fuels, but that doesn't mean there's no abiotic production of methane. And so we're doing some field studies to demonstrate that there was massive abiotic production of methane during metamorphic processes. So as you expose a rock that formed as a sedimentary rock to heat and pressure at greater and greater depth, chemical reactions are generating methane. That methane is trapped as tiny fluid inclusions in the minerals as they grow. We can measure the chemical composition of those fluid inclusions using Raman spectroscopy. And we're finding the same thing in China, these same kinds of methane-rich fluid inclusions. And here we've done some experiments in the laboratory to demonstrate that the experimental simulation matches the production of methane that we're observing in the natural samples.
This production of methane, is that from basically elementary carbon C plus hydrogen, or is it?
So the reaction pathways are more complicated than that. But I'm going to talk about methane for a little while now, and there's a whole series of, there's a Fischer-Tropsch reaction, But in general, there are lots of steps in these reactions, and we don't always know the reaction pathways, but we're constraining them. Let me come to that just now if I can. So one of the things that I talked about earlier was our instrumentation portfolio. And so there's probably been 1 million measurements of the carbon isotopic composition of methane, probably 1 million measurements of the hydrogen isotopic composition of methane. Oil companies do this, dozens, hundreds of times a day. I don't know. But until a couple of years ago, there were exactly 0 measurements of methane with 2 rare isotopes. And we call this clumping. So if you have multiple substitutions of a rare isotope, say deuterium, for a common isotope of the same element, like hydrogen in that case. So imagine instead of CH4, you have CH3D. Okay, that's one rare isotope. But imagine you had C12H2D2. And nobody could actually measure that until we did it a couple of years ago. Or 13CDH3. Now it turns out that for many, many decades, stable isotope geochemistry was based upon integer differences. 1 versus 2, carbon 12 versus carbon 13, oxygen 16 versus oxygen. These are huge percentage differences. They're integer differences. Well, imagine that you have C12D2H2, that's mass 18.0041. And then if you have C13DH3, that's 18.0044. So we need a 1,000-fold increase in mass resolution to make those measurements. We also need a 1,000-fold increase in abundant sensitivity. These are really rare species. And in general, mass resolution and abundant sensitivity are inversely proportional to one another. We need both. So we said this measurement is so important to us, we're going to do it 2 radically different ways so that one can fail utterly and not affect the other. One is going to be through mass spectrometry, essentially a bigger hammer. And people laugh behind my back at that. Then we said we're going to do this spectroscopically, and people laughed at my face at that. The spectroscopic approach worked extremely quickly. We worked with a bunch of atmospheric chemists and geologists at MIT. The atmospheric chemists have been using absorption spectroscopy to measure extremely rare species in Earth's atmosphere and other hemispheres for a very long time. Not these species, not this rare, but they were confident that we could do this. So what we did using absorption spectroscopy is we're able to discriminate between these 2 doubly substituted isotopal logs of methane. Well, actually, no, I take it back. We can measure one of them for the first time. Let me go into this in a little more detail. What is it we're trying to do? So carbon is my favorite element because I'm with the Deep Carbon Observatory. My favorite chemical reaction is really simple. As you can tell, I'm a really simple person, like diamond, CO2. Well, methane plus methane equals methane plus methane. That's the top reaction. But it's actually an isotopic exchange reaction. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, there's 2 different singly substituted species. There's 13C, that's my rare isotope of carbon, H4, so that's one substitution. 12C, that's common. The D's the rare one, 3 hydrogens. So we have a single substitution here, the D, a single substitution here, the 13C. This is the unsubstituted 12CH. This is 99% of what we have. And this is what nobody could measure before. We call this a clumped isotope. It's got 2 rare isotopes. It's got the deuterium and the 13C. But if you can measure all 4 of those, the equilibrium constant of that isotopic exchange reaction is a function of only temperature. Why is that? Delta V is 0. So the volume is controlled by the electronic structure. There's no change in that. Delta V is 0. So we now have an internal geothermometer. How do geologists measure temperature in general? It's equilibrium partitioning among coexisting phases. It could be partitioning of oxygen isotopes among different phases that are in chemical equilibrium, isotopic equilibrium. It could be the partitioning of some element, some chemical element among multiple phases. But to have an internal geothermometer measuring one phase is what we needed to do, and that's why we invested so heavily in this. If we could demonstrate, for example, that the black smoke are here at the bottom of the ocean, at the mid-ocean ridge, remember these were discovered in, I think, the 1970s for the first time. There were all these biological communities that resemble nothing on Earth before. They're completely independent of photosynthesis. Maybe life began in these kinds of environments, but they're really hot there. What temperature did the methane form at? And we can estimate a methane formation temperature. However, it turns out that you have to assume that you've achieved thermodynamic equilibrium. So what we really want are 2 different thermometers. If they give you the same temperature, we're now going to say, well, they're concordant. That's the temperature at which it formed. And if they're discordant, we're actually even luckier. That means thermodynamic equilibrium was not achieved, and we can then get information about history, about process, about provenance. So this graph is showing that if you have one clumped isotope, essentially, this is defined right here, you can measure temperature. And most of the biogenic methane that's we use as a fossil fuel is here. A chemical reaction called serpentinization that's very common on Earth and other planets it can be at very high temperatures, it can be at very low temperatures, but there are also hydrothermal systems like this one here that we'd expect to be around 400 degrees centigrade, and we might even expect this methane to form in the mantle, but we need to be able to measure the temperature at which it formed. There are no biomarkers. So we did this both spectroscopically and with mass spectrometry, and I am missing an important slide. Huh. Let me go to this slide for a second. So this is we had back-to-back papers in Science about this clumped isotope. Now, clumped isotopes have been measured for about 20 years in carbonates. That literature is a mess. I realize I'm on camera, so let me just say, I don't understand that literature. This is a very simple set of measurements that you're looking at the ratios of two signals, sample and a standard, and there are no empirical corrections involved. And our standard is what we're going to call the stochastic distribution. So if I gave you a box of deuteriums, a box of hydrogens, a box of 12 and 13, you mix them up randomly, that's going to be your standard. Thermodynamic equilibrium is a function of temperature. You have an excess of the clump species relative to the stochastic distribution. For reasons we do not understand, that did not predict, a lot of biological processes demonstrate anti-clumping. Now, I did not make this up. Science Magazine made this up. They're saying that if we have thermodynamic equilibrium, we're going to call that, if we have the stochastic distribution, we're going to call that zero. That's the Faraday. The positive clumping, which is here thermodynamic equilibrium, is we can make this calculation fairly straightforward. But for reasons we don't understand, that methane produced by methanogens, by bacteria, and O2 produced by photosynthesis in plants, both show an incredible depletion of the clump species relative to the stochastic distribution. Yeah.
Why do you have 1/32 instead of 1/36?
Let's see.
Right down the middle.
No, it's 1/2 to the 4th.
1/2 to the 4th.
So it's going to go 1/2, 1/4.
There are 36 combinations of two dyes.
Yeah.
And so
I mean, this
That's 1/2 to the 5th.
to the 5th.
that's 1/2 to the 5th. I don't see why you'd have 1/2 to the 5th. The probability of snake eyes is 1/36, not 1/38.
Yeah, he's saying your science people didn't know how to roll dice. They weren't good crap players. So they weren't good crap players, Rudy.
Can somebody else answer that question? Who thinks science is right?
Human error.
And I think it's
Mathematics.
1/36.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go back and look into that. I don't see a reason why that's incorrect.
It won't make any difference as far as company.
No, it's not going to make any difference to us. It's a great question. It makes absolutely zero difference to us, but I think it's either a simple error or we'll have a really great explanation.
And I thought snake eyes was one dye and one spot and one spot, not one spot and two spots.
I think you're right. I think that's what they meant to be defining. Again, maybe I'll never reproduce this diagram. Actually, this was a perspective piece written by, I think, somebody who was at the University of Maryland at the time, Paisley. And so this was, he must have been a reviewer of one of the papers, and he's now at Michigan. So I'm pretty sure this is an authored piece. It's in the front end of Science. This is not the peer-reviewed part. We had, two papers, back-to-back papers in Science with the perspective piece in the front end. But I want to make the point, the mathematical error or not. So we were looking at methane produced in the laboratory by methanogens, right? Bacteria that have this strong anti-clumping behavior. So this is a tool for discriminating the origins and provenance. We were also measuring O2 produced by photosynthesis by terrestrial plants. Now that measurement is trickier than you'd guess, because it turns out that 1880, oxygen 30 would be 36, is far less abundant in Earth's atmosphere than argon 36. Argon is the fourth most abundant gas in the atmosphere. 1880 is really rare. And so when these measurements were made, when this paper was published, they had to purify chemically the oxygen to about 7 nines. When they did that, they almost certainly fractionate the isotopes. With our new mass spectrometers, we can run a football pitch between 1880 and argon-36. So we do purify them chemically, but you don't have to do it to such a high purity that you're going to likely fractionate the isotopes. But the point I want to make, and the point they're making, is that for reasons we don't understand, we do not know if this is a robust result. Biology seems to produce kinetically anti-clumping behavior. Now, one of the things we want to do is, was the methane produced biologically or abiologically? Well, if the temperature is really high, well, it couldn't have been biologic. The highest temperature, microbes ever recorded are 122 degrees centigrade, and some of the methane is being produced at much higher temperatures. It's clearly not biotic. But not all the low temperature methane is produced biotically either. Anyway, let me keep going there. Let me go back actually. So I said we measured this with mass spectrometry, the cover of the International Journal of Mass Spectrometry. These people who did this spectroscopically were much faster, but they can only measure one of the 2 clump species. And in fact, the very first paper that was published in this field was with mass spectrometry. It's a Caltech group, and they wrote combined measurement of, and then they spelled out both of the isotope blocks, and I go, oh, they measured them both. What they did is they measured their sum. Remember, one's 18.044, while the other's 18.041, and there's a huge isobaric interference in between CH5 produced in the source of the mass spectrometer that can be a factor of 10 more abundant than what you're trying to measure. Whenever you have to make a correction that's 10 times bigger than your signal, to worry a lot. We don't have to do that. We just mass resolve this away. So we measure both. We mass resolve the 2 species. We mass resolve the isobaric interference. But in any case, he did this spectroscopically, and it was a very important result. It's arguably much cheaper and faster, but it's not very robust. He's doing this with tunable quantum cascade lasers. We predict in advance where the absorption peaks will be for the various isotopal logs. We're finding them exactly where they're meant to be. We gave him $100,000 to get this kick-started in approximately November of 2012. And then he presented his first results at the National Academies at a meeting with both Frank Press, the past president of the Academy, and Marcia McNutt, a future president, now the president of the Academy, who were in attendance. A few months after we provided his funding, he actually had his very first quantitative measurement. So he's off and running. This is great. This is going to change all of geochemistry, moving away from these expensive mass spectrometers with enormous vacuum systems to spectroscopic techniques that are being used in this way. Anyway. All right. So one of the most important results that we've learned by measuring natural samples now, so now we can measure these clumped isotopes. So I showed you these hot springs on the ocean floors. We've all seen these for decades now. So we know the vent temperature of the water. We measure that with a thermometer. The question is, what temperature does the methane form? And it turns out no matter what the water temperature is that we measure, the methane gives a very narrow and very high range temperature formation. So it appears that the methane formed deep in the oceanic lithosphere at very high temperatures, independent of the vent temperature of these hydrothermal fluids, which would mean it's much, much hotter than any microbe. So this methane would have an abiotic origin. So we're sprouting out abiotic methane onto Earth's ocean floor on a continuing basis. And one of the reasons why these, there are both microbes that consume methane as well as microbes that produce methane, and you need a fuel source in these when we come to our deep life group, and methane is in fact a potential fuel source. So anyway, the mass spectrometer that was designed specifically to address this problem is shown here. It's the Panorama mass spectrometer. It's available commercially. The second one is just being installed in China. The third one will be installed at the University of Maryland this year, I believe. It's fully funded by NSF and their major research instrumentation program. It had to be ranked #1 from the University of Maryland. I think they're allowed, each university can submit 2 proposals, I think. And then it was funded by NSF to buy the second one here. The beauty of this is that this instrument can make the first measurement of dozens and dozens and dozens of isotopic systems that have never been possible to measure before, whereas the absorption spectrometer is tuned precisely to make one measurement. So they have all these different trade-offs. But we're now measuring samples from around the world and getting a sense of which methane is produced abiotically, the pathways of the reaction pathways to produce the methane, and the temperatures at which the methane was produced. We do a lot of measurements of naturally produced hydrogen. Hydrogen is produced in Earth, it's obviously not retained in our atmosphere, so if we're finding it, it's generally being produced as it's being lost. And hydrogen is being produced through a reaction I've already mentioned, the serpentinization reaction is produced through radiolysis. And this paper in Nature doubled the estimate of Earth's annual hydrogen production because we've overlooked really the radiological component of production of hydrogen in the continental crust. So we're measuring samples collected in deep mines around the world, Canada, South Africa, elsewhere, and these samples tend to be very high in reduced gases. We're also measuring the rare gas isotopes, and this is a stunning result, again, in Nature. Precambrian fracture fluids. The rare gases from these fluids give a median age of over 2 billion years. That's over half the age of planet Earth, or about half the age of planet Earth. And the idea that there were fluids isolated in fractures for over 2 billion years, retaining the rare gas isotope systematics, is just a remarkable result. So these are the world's oldest waters. There was huge press about this when this paper first came out. The headline in many cases was, "It tastes terrible." And the reason is they actually sampled the waters. The old waters tend to be very saline. They've been in contact with these rocks for 1 billion years. And we measure them whether they're saline or not. But these samples tend to be very high in hydrogen, very high in methane. So the next question is, we've retained rare gases in these waters for over 2 billion years. Is there life in those waters? So right now, as we speak, we're measuring the genomics of life found in these ancient waters. And we've measured life found in other deep environments at high pressures and temperatures. These may be very different, we don't know. I want to turn back to some of our reservoirs and fluxes work. We sometimes overlook the simplest stuff. For decades, Earth scientists have known that when you take a carbonate and you subduct it at higher pressures and temperatures, you're going to have a decarbonation reaction. And we've sort of simulated this in the laboratory for years. We've actually overlooked significantly release of CO2 from subduction zones as a result of simple dissolution and other fluid rock interactions. So we have vastly overestimated the amount of carbon being returned into Earth's deep interior as a result of plate tectonics. One of the questions is there a balance? Why should there be a balance between carbon being emitted from volcanoes, CO2 emissions from volcanoes, and CO2 from the deep Earth, and CO2 subducted into the deep Earth at subduction zones? The concentration of CO2 has not changed much. Temperature has not changed much over billions of years, sort of on some very gross level. There's been liquid water for most of Earth history. The temperature's been in a fairly narrow range. What regulates that? Well, at one level, the bulk chemical composition of the atmosphere, and that's largely controlled by this deep carbon cycle. And we have to make sure that we're understanding the processes that are involved in the chemical mass transfer. And so it turns out that oxidation and reduction, so graphite forms as bicarbonate reduction during subduction. It turns out that if you look at the magma production at the mid-ocean ridges, that the oxygen fugacity is controlled, again, by the small amount of carbon in the sample. So here, the redox heterogeneity in the mid-ocean ridge is the headline, but what's controlling the redox heterogeneity is, and in fact, the caption of this picture states that, is the carbon in the melt source region. So we've done a lot of measurements of volcanoes. This is very dangerous. We send graduate students and so forth and postdocs to these summits. We leave instruments there.
That's why you don't have to go yourself.
You don't have to go yourself. But honestly, we want to do this from space. And people, for some reason, have this all wrong. For decades, we have measured SO2 emissions from space. This is very easy to do. The signal is very strong. The background is very low. This paper in 2017 is the very first measurement of a peer-reviewed paper of CO2 emissions from point sources from space. This is really important because you want to do two things. You want to measure volcano emissions globally in real time from space if you can. We've got one measurement so far. You also, if I could measure power plants, that'd be great. So this is actually measuring CO2 emissions over the LA basin, but imagine if you could measure emissions from power plants, that'd be terrific. So anyway, this is a huge breakthrough if we can do this. Now this is misusing a satellite, the OCO2, the Orbiting Carbon Observatory, to make a measurement it was specifically designed not to make. It was looking at continental scale, ocean basin scale. We're trying to look at point sources. And obviously, we'd like to optimize a satellite for that purpose. That's not going to happen anytime soon. But I just want to emphasize that we're making lots of new measurements to reduce the uncertainties, really. And our ultimate goal is to have some sense of the reservoirs and fluxes of the deep carbon cycle. And we're later than I thought, so I'm going to skip through some things here. I just want to note solid storage in this reservoir, 0 to 47. The units are megatons of carbon or something like that. I've forgotten what the units are. But I just want to emphasize how large these ranges are. And then we're making specific measurements here, 0 to 52, to better constrain these fluxes. And we're trying to understand the processes. It turns out that in many volcanic systems, Emily was an undergraduate, she wrote the science paper, that there's a lot of assimilation of crustal carbon in these volcanoes that were thought to be carbon being subducted from much greater depths. And then ultimately we're trying to see to what extent is Earth's atmosphere controlled by this organic carbon subduction into the deep earth. And Raj Dasgupta and Megan Duncan here proposed that subduction is the key process for the great oxidation event that led to the oxygen-rich atmosphere that we have today. I'm going to skip through most of our deep life work. We're doing a lot of work on the ocean seafloor, and I've mentioned the serpentinization reaction. So if you react water with olivine, you're going to produce a mineral called serpentine. You also produce H2. H2 is the fuel for most of these microbes. You react to H2 with reduced carbon, you make methane abiotically, and that again is a fuel for a lot of microbes. So we follow the hydrogen, we follow the methane to understand the deep biosphere. We're looking at the deep biosphere in places where there's very little sediment and there's very little life. We're trying to, these microbes, this is again is the drill ship, there's the helicopter pad. We broke the record for deepest core recovery on this expedition, but it turns out that this coal bed sediments, these were formed on the continents as a coal bed. They're now 2.5 kilometers below the seafloor. They've been underwater for tens of millions of years. They have microbes in them that resemble the terrestrial coal seams. So these ecosystems have apparently survived tens of millions of years and preserve a lot of the biological signature of the coal bed. We now have our most recent expedition to measure the temperature limits of life, so this core is a continuous core. This is the first time we've actually used the helicopter pad to take the freshest sample from the ship to an ultra-clean laboratory in Kochi, Japan, and then measure the abundances and then ultimately the genomics of this life as fast as we can in minimizing contamination. In addition to working in the ocean basins, we're obviously working in the continents, both with continental scientific drilling and in deep mines, and we're finding all kinds of interesting life there, and we're trying to get a new estimate of subsurface life. What fraction of Earth's life is the cell count or the mass, whatever unit you want to use, is deep below Earth's surface, and we're greatly constraining that. But I then want to, the last thing I want to say about the terrestrial life, how did life form on Earth? Well, we don't know, but this very recent paper in Nature demonstrates that abiotic synthesis of amino acids is occurring in the oceanic lithosphere in conjunction with the serpentinization reaction I've been discussing so many times. And the idea that if you can produce amino acids abiotically, is it happening now? Has it been happening throughout Earth history? The idea of the Miller reaction happening in real life under natural conditions, happening today, happening in deep Earth time, is just sort of a shocking result here. If this is reproduced, this could be one of our most important results to demonstrate the abiotic synthesis of amino acids in the oceanic lithosphere. We're not confining our measurements to Earth. We have several members of the Mars rover team. Just this paper was published a few months ago on organic synthesis on Mars, a reduction of CO2. And then my favorite, the second author, I always like to say that this mission, this is the Cassini mission to Saturn and the moons of Saturn. Chris Gwine, our early career scientist, who's the second author, he was conceived at about the same time that this mission was conceived. Deep space exploration is not for the impatient, and they found hydrogen plumes coming out of the cracks in the ice. So there's an ice-covered ocean at Titan, Enceladus rather. So this is the moon Enceladus, where we've known for a long time. There's an ice-covered ocean. The Cassini spacecraft did a flyby. We detected hydrogen. Chris, who was a postdoc at the Geophysical Lab at the time, speculated that it's fluid rock interactions at the rocky ocean bottom of this ice-covered ocean that produce the hydrogen. That same serpentinization reaction I've talked about so many times is producing the H2, which is now being detected by Cassini. Well, that's not the latest word from Cassini. They're finding much higher hydrocarbons coming out of these vents in the ice, these cracks in the ice, on top of the ocean in Enceladus. So the Deep Carbon Observatory is concluding its decadal program this year. We have a whole series of synthesis projects. We have a couple of books coming out. And I do want to mention a little bit about the media coverage of this work. You know, these super deep diamonds have attracted a lot of attention. The work in Oman was featured in the New York Times. The ultimate answer to the question, what is the broader impact of your research? I should have had the title of the New York Times piece. The title, I couldn't have made this up. It's a magazine article. It says, "How the Rocks of Oman Will Save the World." And it has to do with the idea that it's a carbon sequestration play. Olivine plus CO2 makes a mineral magnesite, which is thermodynamically stable and very safe, and you can sequester in principle the CO2 indefinitely, safely through that reaction. There are some problems that we're addressing there. And then most recently, we had the story about life in the deep earth, and it was covered around the world. The New York Times ran this story as well. Deep beneath your feet, they live in the octillions. And again, there's greater awareness that the deep biosphere is a very large fraction of the biosphere of this planet. So we've been very fortunate to get a lot of media attention this year. And I always want to close with our sponsors. So although we have this seed funding from the Sloan Foundation, this pledge of $50 million over 10 years, we've leveraged that with about $500 million of support from other organizations around the world. And I always want to thank them. And thank you.
Well, thank you. Open our eyes. This is an aspect of carbon cycle that I think none of us have ever been exposed to until you have done it for us today.
Well, you know, I sometimes get grief from people who overlook this part of it. But our ultimate goal is to understand the entire carbon cycle, including the shallow and the deep carbon cycle.
Did you manage to use the same techniques on examining plumes from terrestrial volcanoes as on Enceladus? Or is it?
So that's a really interesting question. In some cases, the space missions are leading the instrumentation development. So there actually is a mass spectrometer on that satellite, but the development of the absorption spectrometers to measure chemical concentration and isotopic composition has actually been driven in part by space missions, where you need low power consumption as well as low weight. And obviously you don't have big vacuum
So the
systems.
answer is yes.
And small
So, yeah.
volume.
Well, there are some in common, yes, but there are some that are not.
To go back to the fluctuation around the pH, is that around a pH of 7 or is?
So I should know this, but the neutral pH under those conditions is nowhere near 7. I think it's much lower, but I'll have to check that for you.
Okay, so a little bit more acidic.
Well, I mean, it would be the balance between OH plus and H plus.
Okay.
OH minus and H plus
Okay,
is
so
going
you're
to be
saying that under higher pressure that,
Is that-
it's higher temperature and higher pressure.
Pressure.
Yeah.
Is that by volume or by weight?
So it's molar. It's molar.
Well,
No.
by
It's
count.
negative log of the hydrogen atom concentration.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's by moles. It has to be by moles.
So it's by volume.
Yes.
It's a charge balance. So
Yes.
it's by charge then.
by
yeah.
charge, which is going to be by moles.
Uh-huh.
It's neither volume nor weight, although they would.
Well, I guess the question is first is, can some of this buried carbon come out so that it can seriously affect, you know, the carbon balance up here on the surface? Because right now we don't need more carbon on all this.
So the
So that's the first.
anthropogenic production of CO2 is much greater than the volcanic release of CO2
Okay.
today, although our measurements of volcanic release have huge error bars. But it's much smaller than anthropogenic today. Having said that, we know that there were times in Earth history when there were large igneous provinces being created, sort of thousands of cubic kilometers of magma. I
Right.
wouldn't be surprised
Magma
if it
traps,
sometimes,
yeah.
right, the
Yeah.
Deccan traps, the Siberian traps, that it's sometimes in Earth history, if that magmatism could have produced CO2 emissions that were much, much higher than today.
And the climate changed in big ways.
Well, that's the question.
We just weren't around.
You know, so we have to be careful between correlation and causality,
Yeah.
and you know, there's a big dispute right now. There are some big climate changes associated with some of these large igneous provinces, and there are also some impacts around some of these same times. So there's a huge amount of research trying to resolve those issues.
And sort of a side question of that is, have climate deniers ever attempted to use some of this information to debunk or to try
So
to?
we actually have developed talking points.
Yeah, I mean, this
to-
is something you might want to keep in mind.
Right. If somebody were intending to misuse some of the science, how would we respond? What would we say? And again, the moral hazard of, gee, you know, there's large natural production of CO2. Why should we worry about anthropogenic emissions? And
Yeah.
the first point is that right now anthropogenic emissions are much, much higher than natural emissions. Whether natural emissions were much higher in the past than they are now, well, in many cases that led to catastrophic climate change. So, gee.
But over a long period of time.
Well,
you know,
so abrupt climate change, we're now being able to resolve substantial changes on decadal timescales. It's kind of hard to make some of these, to resolve. So if something's rare, a rare event, the only way to get multiple examples in general is to have observations over a long period of time, but it's the temporal resolution gets very, very difficult. But we're getting increased temporal resolution, and there do appear to be significant abrupt changes in decadal timescales. Is the best we can do right now, certainly at century and 1,000-year timescales.
So
You
with
mentioned
regard to
that,
that,
Go ahead.
You mentioned that this is the 10th year of a 10-year project, and you're working on a 2020 plan, I think it was. So I presume that this is going to continue, and you have multiple sponsors now. And can you just give us a little
Yeah.
hint of what the 2020 plan is, or the future?
Right, sure. So we did form a committee a couple of years ago called Task Force 2020 to plan beyond the end of this decadal program. And I must say, my hat's off to the Sloan Foundation for making a large commitment over a protracted period of time with a very definite end. They have these decadal programs which end at the end of a decade. Having said that, you know, there is an exception or two. The Sloan Digital Sky Surveys, this 5th iteration with lots of other support as well. And many of the individual research projects have strong support. What's hard to fund in the world today are international interdisciplinary science projects. And so the secretariat function is one of the most difficult things to fund, the sort of headquarters function. It would not be so, it's relatively easy to get continuing funding for a volcano observing group or a diamond research group. The diamond research group, by the way, is fascinating from the standpoint of community building. The scientific success is almost entirely contingent on the community building. That's a community that has been highly fragmented for decades. They didn't tend to share their diamond samples. They're very valuable. They didn't tend to go to different laboratories to apply different techniques to these rare materials. And so they were very, very limited. And when we began working with industry, the Gemological Institute of America, can we borrow some of your diamonds and make some non-destructive Raman spectrum measurements, you know, FTIR measurements maybe? Can you give us some offcuts of these really big diamonds, the stuff you don't want? And we can actually make destructive analysis. So the acknowledgments in the Hydrous Ringwoodite paper in Nature are not for DCO funding, but for DCO to bring the community together. That was the key step. Once the community is together, that community is going to stay together. That is a cultural change, I think. But we don't have all of the parts of the program funded going forward, but we're working real hard at continuing as much as we can.
I'm also grateful to the Sloan Foundation because they put me through college.
Well, you know,
50 years ago.
they have a fellows program, right? And
Yes. And you mentioned carbon sequestration. Some scientists at, I think chemists at the Naval Research Laboratory got in trouble for doing some very interesting experiments. They managed to make diamonds out of the odor from the sewage treatment plant next door. They
So-
weren't funded to do it. That's why they got in
well, let me
trouble.
talk for a minute both about.
Is that a reasonable way to sequester carbon?
So we tend to do things that other groups are not doing. There are lots of carbon sequestration groups. But for more than 100 years, it was known that if you take this common mineral, olivine, it's the majority of the upper mantle. It's not so common at Earth's surface, but it occurs. When you react it with CO2, you're going to make a mineral called magnesite, magnesium carbide. It's really safe. It's not soft like talc, but it's like, it's thermodynamically irreversible. Now, there were several problems with this as a carbon sequestration strategy. One, it's also been known for 100 years, this reaction is unbelievably slow at 20 degrees centigrade. It's just kinetically. So Peter Kelvin at Columbia made 3 observations. One, that at 180 degrees, and you do not have to go very deep in the Earth's interior in Oman to get to 180 degrees. The reaction rate's 1,000,000 times faster. So your kinetic barrier is gone, just forget it. 2, and this is not so important, the reaction is mildly exothermic, so you're going to generate a little heat. The key is you don't have to put a lot of heat in, a lot of energy in. You actually get a little heat out. Third and most importantly, the delta V, the change in volume of this reaction is enormous. It's about plus 30%. We were all told as students canonically, with no data or evidence to back this up, that the delta V was so large you'd plug up the permeability and porosity, grinding the reaction to a halt. Well, Peter has a better idea. Delta V is so large it's going to fracture the rocks. I call it self-fracking. He hates that. Now, you can calculate this till the cows come home. You can do experiments in the laboratory. You have to do a pilot project in nature. And in Iceland, and I just came back from Iceland in October, they're working in a much less favorable geologic environment for a similar but not the same carbon sequestration strategy. Their environment minister is all over this, okay? For a variety of reasons, other countries don't want to do this. Now, in part, they think CO2 is a bad, not a good. Now, they could be, some of these countries could become the Kuwait of carbon sequestration credits if they were tradable. But the other thing is many people incorrectly think this would be free air capture. Now, that might be a good thing if you could do that. But if you were capturing CO2 from the free air, remember, it's 400 parts per million and growing. It's not a high, free air captures. But it's mostly going to be European, Chinese, and American carbon. Yeah. Nobody wants your trash, right? So the idea that some country is going to basically import the waste of these other industrialized countries doesn't go over. What you'd want to do, well, I have lots of stranded natural gas in my opinion. They used to flare it. They can't get it to market. There's no pipeline. You could build natural, and they used to actually have sustainable agriculture in parts of Oman for like 1,000 years. They then used electric pumps to take out the groundwater. Well, they got seawater incursion. They poisoned their groundwater. Well, now they need to purify their groundwater. Well, that's very energy intensive. Well, desalination is really energy intensive. But they have lots of stranded natural gas. One idea is to put a natural gas electric generating plant above the ophiolite and inject the CO2 at 180 degrees. That's what they're basically trying something like this in Oman, in Iceland. Now, it may not work, but we need an industrial scale pilot plant. That's why that New York Times writer wrote what he wrote, how the rocks of Oman may save the world. Now, I want to point out there's no silver bullet, that there are lots of different ways to sequester CO2. Some will get out, it'll leak, in groundwater, and it'll change the pH and all that kind of thing. This is a pretty good solution. If everything were to work, we don't know that it would, and that it's safe and permanent, we think. Safe, you have to worry about fracking issues. There's lots of unknowns, obviously, but it's not going to work everywhere. You need the right geologic environment. So it would work in areas where other geologic reservoir solutions would not be applicable. So that's kind of the carbon sequestration. We are not focusing on things that lots of other groups are doing. They're doing great work. We're going to let them do that, but we have some ideas. You mentioned diamonds. I do want to point out that the Geophysical Lab is best known for its high pressure research, and for many, many years, we developed all kinds of piston cylinder apparatus and so forth, which have relatively large volumes. But we were working for the highest pressures with diamond anvil cells. But you need large, very high quality diamonds, right? Well, they're very expensive, and for years we used to get them from the customs service. They were smuggled diamonds, and they would just be used for scientific research. Well, that supply dried up decades ago. So more recently, we either had to purchase them or we grow our own. So we actually have patents to grow diamonds metastably, way outside their stability fields, and we can get GIA and other groups to certify these as gem quality diamonds. GIA doesn't like to certify synthetic diamonds, and De Beers now has its own company. We have patents, they have patents. And ours are being produced and sold for both jewelry purposes, and we use them for our diamond anvil cells. So we grow our own diamonds. They need a diamond seed. It can either be natural or synthetic. They tend to grow mostly along the C-axis. We don't quite understand why. But they're large, and they tend to prefer growth in one crystallographic direction than another. But we can grow very, very large ones. We have beautiful pictures around our laboratory of diamonds grown in our lab. They're now off-site in a commercial licensed company. So yeah, diamonds. I think someday we're going to be plating our iPhones with diamonds. It's going to be cheap and easy. You know.
Somebody built a watch crystal.
Oh yeah. No, I think
way,
that's.
And it turned out that a jeweler broke it because he didn't realize that the diamond is brittle.
Right. No. So you have all these material parts, but the idea that you can have diamond drill bits. I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but there's now I mentioned high pressure research. I do want to close by saying, you know, the Geophysical Lab does a lot of work at high pressures on material science as well as earth science. The day before yesterday is a seminal day in the history, arguably, of the Geophysical Lab and perhaps broader science. APS announced physical review letters 2 days ago. High temperature, near room temperature superconductor produced by our group. It's led by Russ Hemlick, who's moved from the Geophysical Lab to George Washington. But a couple of our postdocs and research scientists are the first author and co-authors of this paper on 260 Kelvin superconductivity. I think it shatters the record. It's that's minus 13 C, getting close to room temperature. It's a lanthanum hydride, and it's also at around 150 gigapascals to 200 gigapascals. So, you know,
So high pressure.
high pressure. But you know, I think there will be additional Nobel prizes for superconductivity if we can get true room temperature superconductors even at high pressure. But anyway, that's just published the day before yesterday. The news has been leaking out. I think Nature ran a news article late last year. I'm not sure about that. But APS has put out a news article, and there's a press release, and this is a stunning result. Anyway, it's our high pressure group that's doing this, that does a lot of material science work that's unrelated to the earth sciences.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, we want to thank you again.
Does the moon seem to be similarly equipped with carbon?
You know, the moon has way more water than we thought, and so we've made a whole series of measurements of carbon and water on the moon. These are all Apollo samples, or there's a rare class of meteorites where we have, you know, something hit the moon, a bit of the moon came to the Earth, and so we've been measuring both of these meteoritic samples of the moon and Apollo samples of the moon.
And?
Well, and there's far more water than previously thought in the silicate.
What about the carbon?
The carbon is still low, but it could have a very significant effect on the melting behavior. It turns out that a small amount of carbon can affect a lot of, just has a small amount of volatiles in general, whether it's water or CO2, has disproportionate effects on the melting and crystallization of magnets.
How much water is there?
So I knew you were going to ask that, and I think it's I want to say I'm going to have to check. My good colleague Eric Howry died at age 52 about 6 months ago, and his obituary in the Washington Post talked about his most important contribution, which is the measurement of water on the moon. And I think the concentration is comparable to Earth's mantle, but I have to double check that.
Well, I once calculated that if you dug a pit, filled it with water on the moon, at 200-foot depth, you would have Earth normal pressure.
So this is all structurally bound water. I know there's ice in the surface in some of the permanently shaded craters, but this is structurally bound water in the minerals. So we know it came from the moon's interior.
Mm-hmm.